It was in the earth that they found their power, not in the sky, which belonged to the roaring phantoms of American air power, not on the surface, which was the domain of the helicopter and the armored column. Their power was subterranean. It was dug with hands and simple tools, a testament to patience and revolutionary will. Deep beneath the ravaged landscape of the Iron Triangle, a Vietcong political officer reviewed a stack of papers by the dim, flickering light of a coconut oil lamp. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp clay, sweat, and cooking smoke that had nowhere to go. Above him, he could feel the vibrations more than hear the sound, the rhythmic, earth-shaking thud of bombs from a B-52 arc light strike walking across the jungle. Each impact was a distant earthquake. The ground trembled, and dust sifted down from the ceiling of the tunnel, but here, 10 meters down, he was safe. The Americans could bomb the jungle back into a prehistoric swamp. They could defoliate it, burn it, and crater it until the very geography was unrecognizable. It did not matter. They were giants, loud and clumsy, fighting a war on a single plane of existence. He and his comrades were fighting a three-dimensional war. The tunnels were their fortress, their barracks, their hospital, their supply depot, and their highway. They were the physical manifestation of an ideology that had burrowed into the very soul of the country. From these hidden arteries, they could launch attacks with impunity, striking at the behemoth's ankles and then melting back into the soil before the giant could even turn a swat at them. They were ghosts. They were everywhere and nowhere. The officers smiled a thin, confident smile. The Americans, with all their technology and wealth, could not defeat an army they could not find. They could not kill what they could not see. The earth, their sacred Vietnamese earth, protected them. It was their shield. It was their greatest weapon. He believed this with the totality of his being. What he did not know, what he could not possibly comprehend in that moment of supreme confidence, was that the Americans had finally understood the nature of the war they were fighting. They had realized that the battle was not for the sky, or for the paddies, or for the villages on the surface. The decisive battle would be for the dark, suffocating space right beneath their feet. And they were sending men into the darkness to claim it. The tunnels were not a new invention. Their genesis lay in the long, bitter struggle against the French. They began as simple caches, hiding spots for a few men or a handful of rifles, dug beneath the floors of rural huts. They were a peasant's answer to a colonial army's patrols. But with the arrival of the Americans, with their overwhelming technological superiority, this simple tactic evolved into a grand, strategic doctrine. The small caches grew, linked together, and deepened. What started as a foxhole became a network. What was a network became a subterranean city. The most legendary of these was the system honeycombing the Siu-Chi district, a mere 30 kilometers from the heart of Saigon. By 1965, what lay beneath this unassuming patch of rural terrain was a multi-level labyrinth stretching over 250 kilometers. It was a staggering feat of engineering, accomplished with almost no modern equipment. The construction was a brutal, manual affair. Teams of Vietcong fighters and local villagers worked in shifts, often at night, to avoid detection from the air. The primary tools were simple hoes with short handles and woven baskets. A digger would squat in the narrow passage, scraping away at the hard laterite clay, filling basket after basket. The excavated soil would be passed down a human chain and carefully dispersed. Not a single mound of fresh earth could be left to betray their work. It was scattered in rivers, spread thin in rice paddies, or used to fill American bomb craters. The tunnels themselves were a marvel of intuitive design, a masterclass in defensive architecture born from desperation. They were rarely straight, zigzagging every 10 meters to prevent an intruder from being able to fire down a long stretch of corridor. This design also served to dissipate the blast from a grenade or satchel charge. They were built for the Vietnamese body. They were narrow, often less than a meter high, forcing anyone taller than 5.5 feet to crawl or stoop. This was a deliberate, ergonomic form of warfare. It made movement for the larger-statured American soldier exhausting and clumsy, while the smaller Vietcong could move with relative speed and ease. The entrances were masterpieces of camouflage. A trapdoor, no bigger than a dinner plate, could be hidden under a patch of grass, beneath the roots of a tree, in the floor of a peasant's hut, or even at the bottom of a pigsty. A soldier could stand directly on top of one and have no idea that an entire enemy battalion was breathing just inches beneath his boots. Ventilation shafts, essential for survival, were disguised as anthills or termite mounds. To the American eye, they were just another feature of the jungle landscape. To the Viet Cong, they were lifelines, bringing precious oxygen into the Stygian depths. The architects of this underworld understood their enemy's methods. They anticipated the American response. When the GIs discovered a tunnel, their first instinct would be to use gas or explosives. So the Viet Cong built countermeasures. They installed U-shaped water traps or water plugs at key junctions. These were simple dips in the tunnel floor that were kept filled with water. Anyone passing through had to submerge themselves completely. For the Viet Cong, it was a minor inconvenience. For a cloud of CS gas, it was an impassable barrier protecting the deeper sections of the complex. They built heavily reinforced, expertly camouflaged trapdoors at regular intervals. These could seal off sections of the tunnel, containing a breach or trapping intruders. They could withstand the blast of a grenade, turning the tunnel itself into a weapon against those who dared to enter. Life inside this subterranean world was a unique kind of hell. It was a world without a sun. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the feeble glow of a candle or a fat-burning lamp. The air was thin and foul, thick with the exhaled breath of hundreds of men, the smoke from cooking fires, and the stench of human waste and unwashed bodies. During heavy American operations, entire communities would be forced to live underground for weeks at a time. Disease ran rampant. Malaria, dysentery, and intestinal parasites were constant companions. The tunnels teemed with life, none of it pleasant. Scorpions, spiders, fire ants, and centipedes were an ever-present nuisance. More feared were the snakes, including the lethally venomous kite, known to the GIs as the two-step snake for the number of steps a man could take after being bitten. Yet they endured. They adapted. Within these sprawling complexes, the Viet Cong recreated an entire society. There were large chambers that served as command posts, their walls adorned with maps. There were armories filled with weapons captured from the Americans or smuggled down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. There were classrooms where political cadres indoctrinated new recruits. There were printing presses churning out propaganda leaflets. There were even fully equipped hospitals. Surgeries were performed by flashlight, on operating tables carved from the earth itself. Medical supplies were scarce, often consisting of herbs and medicines stolen from American bases. A captured field dressing was a priceless treasure. They established kitchens with clever chimney systems designed to diffuse the smoke over a wide area, making it invisible from the air. They slept in excavated chambers, stringing hammocks from the earthen walls. They even had theaters where performers would sing patriotic songs and perform skits to keep morale high. For the American forces on the surface, the effect of this underground fortress was maddening. It created an army of ghosts. Patrols would sweep through an area, finding nothing, only to be ambushed minutes later by an enemy who seemed to materialize from thin air. Snipers would fire from unseen positions and then vanish. Mortar rounds would rain down from a patch of jungle that had just been declared secure. It was profoundly disorienting. It defied the conventional logic of warfare. The enemy was not over the next hill. He was under your feet. General William Westmoreland, the commander of American forces in Vietnam, recognized the magnitude of the problem. He understood that the tunnels were not just a tactical nuisance. They were the central nervous system of the insurgency in the region. He wrote, "It was a honeycomb of tunnels and other fortifications, an underground bastion, a base for control of the Saigon region." The American military, an organization built on the principles of overwhelming firepower and technological solutions, threw everything it had at the problem. Their first approach was brute force. They carpet-bombed the areas with B-52s, turning square miles of jungle into a lunar landscape. The bombs churned the earth, collapsing some shallow tunnels, but the deeper, reinforced command bunkers often survived the onslaught. The sheer scale of the networks meant that bombing was like trying to kill a termite colony by stomping on one anthill. They tried a more direct approach. When a tunnel entrance was found, infantry units would try to destroy it. They tossed grenades in. They lowered blocks of C4 on ropes and detonated them. The explosions would seal one entrance, but the zigzag design and blast doors meant the damage was often localized. The Vietcong would simply dig their way out through another exit or repair the damage later. Next came the tunnel flushing teams. These were infantrymen tasked with clearing the entrances. They would pump vast quantities of CS gas, a potent form of tear gas, into the holes. They called it gas and gals, hoping to flush out the enemy into the waiting arms of the surface troops. But the Viet Cong, equipped with captured American gas masks or simple rags soaked in mud and urine, often just waited it out in sections protected by the water traps. They tried flooding the tunnels, pumping in thousands of gallons of water from nearby rivers. The water would fill a few chambers before being absorbed by the porous earth or diverted by the canny design of the network. They even brought in German shepherd dogs, trained to sniff out the hidden entrances. The Viet Cong countered this by placing stolen American soap or pepper around their entrances, masking the human scent and confusing the dogs. The dogs were also prime targets for booby traps placed just inside the tunnel mouths. Every technological solution was met with a simple, clever, low-tech counter. Every attempt at a conventional military response was frustrated by an unconventional defense. The Americans owned the surface. They could walk anywhere they wanted, but the war was being won and lost in a place they could not reach. A sense of profound frustration grew within the American command. They were fighting an invisible enemy. They were losing men to an army they couldn't see. They were conquering territory during the day, only to cede it back to the subterranean ghosts at night. The realization dawned slowly, reluctantly. If you couldn't bomb them out, and you couldn't gas them out, and you couldn't flood them out, there was only one option left. You had to go in after them. You had to fight them in their world, on their terms, in the dark. There was no official selection process, no formal training school, no specialized military occupational specialty for this new kind of warrior. They were simply volunteers. They were men who, for reasons of their own, bravado, a sense of duty, a touch of fatalism, or perhaps just a desire to protect their friends on the surface, raised their hands for the most dangerous job in the war. They came primarily from the ranks of the engineers and the infantry. They tended to be smaller men, wiry and lean, for the simple physical reason that they had to fit into the cramped confines of the tunnels. They were given a nickname that was both descriptive and slightly macabre. They were called the Tunnel Rats. Their origins were informal. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, AT2V, operating alongside American forces, had encountered similar, though less extensive, tunnel systems earlier. Their engineers, particularly Captain Sandy McGregor, pioneered the technique of going into the tunnels to explore them firsthand. The Americans learned from their Australian allies, adapting the practice to the vast complexes they were now facing. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, operating in the heart of the Iron Triangle, was one of the first to formalize its own teams. So did the 25th Infantry Division, the Tropic Lightning, whose area of operations included the infamous CUCH system. The training for Tunnel Rat was brutal, immediate, and unforgiving. It was on-the-job training where the final exam was survival. A veteran would take a new volunteer to a captured and cleared tunnel entrance. He would hand him a flashlight and a pistol and give him a few words of advice. Don't bunch up. Don't fire on full automatic. Watch out for wires. And if you get stuck, for God's sake, don't panic. Then, the new man would be sent down into the blackness alone. His first trip might only be a few meters, but it was enough to see if he could handle the primal, claustrophobic fear. Many couldn't. The terror of being buried alive, of the unknown pressing in from all sides, was too much. There was no shame in it. This was a job that defied all normal instinct for self-preservation. Those who could control their fear learned the trade from the men who had survived it. They learned to move slowly, deliberately, a sense at a time. They learned to trust their sense of touch, running their fingers along the walls to feel for the telltale tautness of a tripwire. They learned to listen for the scrape of a boot, the click of a safety being released, the sound of breathing that was not their own. They learned to smell for the scent of nuoc mam, the fermented fish sauce that was a staple of the Vietnamese diet, a sure sign that the enemy was near. The equipment they carried was a study in minimalism. In a war defined by advanced technology, the Tunnel Rats kit was stripped down to the bare essentials. It was a recognition that in the subterranean realm, complexity was a liability. Standard-issue rifles like the M16 were useless. They were too long to maneuver around the tight corners, and their powerful 556mm round would create a deafening, disorienting muzzle blast in the enclosed space. The overpenetration of the round was also a risk. A missed shot could ricochet wildly off the hard clay walls. The preferred weapon was a pistol. Many carried the standard M1911-45 caliber automatic. Its heavy, subsonic round was less likely to ricochet and had tremendous stopping power at close range, the only range that mattered in a tunnel. Others favored revolvers, like the Smith & Wesson 38 Special. A revolver had a key advantage. It would not jam from the dirt and dust that was everywhere. If a round failed to fire, you could simply pull the trigger again. In the pitch black, where clearing a stoppage was a death sentence, this reliability was paramount. Some tunnel rats acquired more exotic weapons. Suppressed pistols were highly prized, as they reduced the blinding flash and deafening roar of a gunshot, preserving the shooter's night vision and hearing. Some men carried sawed-off shotguns, devastatingly effective at point-blank range. The second most important piece of equipment was the flashlight. Usually it was a standard issue, right-angle flashlight. They learned not to hold it in front of their chest. The enemy, waiting in ambush, would fire at the light. So they held it out to the side, away from their body, a simple trick to draw fire away from their center of mass. Beyond that, there was little else. A knife for probing suspicious-looking objects and for close-quarters fighting. A communications wire, a simple telephone line spooled out behind them, was their only link to the surface world. It served as a guide to find their way back and a means to report their findings. They called it going on the wire. They wore no helmets, which were too bulky and obstructed their hearing. They stripped off their web gear in packs, which would snag on the narrow walls. They often went in with just a pistol, a flashlight, and a knife. They were deliberately making themselves vulnerable to be more effective. This minimalist loadout revealed a profound truth about the war. America's industrial might, its air power, its artillery, its vast logistical train, none of it mattered down there. The conflict was reduced to its most primal form, man against man, in the dark, with the most basic of tools. It was a contest of nerve, instinct, and raw courage. The descent began with the discovery of an entrance. A GI on patrol might notice a patch of ground that seemed too uniform, or a GI might literally fall through a camouflage trapdoor. Once an entrance was found and secured by the surface troops, the tunnel rat would prepare to go down. He would strip off his gear, check his weapon and flashlight, and take a deep breath of the hot, humid jungle air. It would be the last fresh air he would taste for a while. Then, feet first, he would lower himself into the hole. The moment the surface light disappeared, a profound sensory shift occurred. The world contracted to the narrow beam of his flashlight. The cacophony of the jungle, the insects, the birds, the distant sound of helicopters, vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence. The only sounds were his own breathing, the thumping of his own heart, and the scrape of his clothes against the earthen walls. The air itself changed. It became cool, musty, and oxygen-deprived. The smell of the clay was overpowering. Every inch of progress was a battle against fear. His mind would play tricks on him. A drip of water sounded like a footstep. The rustle of a rat sounded like a weapon being readied. Claustrophobia was a physical presence, a weight on his chest. The knowledge that tons of earth were pressing down on him was a constant psychological burden. And then there were the traps. The Vietcong were masters of improvised lethality. They turned the tunnels into a gauntlet of hidden dangers. The most common was the simple punji stake. A sharpened piece of bamboo, sometimes tipped with poison or human excrement to cause infection, would be hidden in a small pit. A man crawling forward could easily put his hand or knee on one. Tripwires were everywhere. A thin, almost invisible wire would be stretched across the tunnel, connected to a grenade with the pin partially pulled. The slightest pressure would detonate it. Sometimes the wire was connected to a simple firearm cartridge. A nail would be positioned to strike the primer, firing the bullet into the leg or torso of the man who triggered it. The tunnel rats learned to probe constantly with their hands or a knife, sweeping the path ahead of them before every move. The Vietcong also used venomous creatures as weapons. They would tie bamboo vipers, known for their aggressive nature, to the ceiling of the tunnel, where they would strike at the face of anyone passing underneath. They would keep boxes of scorpions that could be overturned onto an intruder. These were acts of psychological warfare as much as physical. The fear of what might be in the darkness was as debilitating as any actual weapon. Encounters with the enemy were sudden, brutal, and intimate. A tunnel rat might round a corner and find himself face to face with a Vietcong soldier. There was no time for aiming, no room for tactics. It was pure instinct. The world would erupt in a blinding flash and a deafening explosion of sound. In the space of a heartbeat, one man would be dead. Sergeant Harold Wadley, a tunnel rat with the 1st Infantry Division, described the experience. You're down there, all by yourself in the dark with a flashlight and a .45. You don't know what's around the next corner. It could be a booby trap, it could be a snake, it could be Charlie. The adrenaline is just pumping. You can hear your heart beating in your ears. The combat was uniquely terrifying. The muzzle flash from a pistol would temporarily blind both shooter and target. The concussion of the gunshot would reverberate through the narrow passage, stunning the senses. After the shot, there was a moment of ringing silence and absolute darkness, as both men fumbled to see if the other was still a threat. Sometimes, the enemy was not a soldier, but a civilian. Tunnel rats would break into chambers and find women and children huddled in the dark. They would find wounded men in makeshift hospitals too weak to fight. These encounters added a layer of moral complexity to an already nightmarish job. But the work yielded incredible results. The tunnel rats were not just killing the enemy. They were gathering intelligence that was changing the course of the war in their sector. They were, in effect, performing reconnaissance in the enemy's headquarters. They discovered vast caches of weapons, ammunition, and food. They found maps detailing Vietcong troop movements and plans for upcoming attacks. They captured thousands of pages of documents, personnel rosters, intelligence reports, political directives. This treasure trove of information allowed the American command to understand their enemy in a way that had never been possible before. They could anticipate attacks, target key leaders, and disrupt the Vietcong's command and control structure. One tunnel rat from the 25th Infantry Division, Stuart Green, recalled finding a complete plan for an attack on his own division's base camp. At Siuchi, the documents were rushed to the surface, translated, and within hours, the American forces were able to set up an ambush for the attackers. The intelligence gathered by a single man in a tunnel had saved hundreds of American lives. The work of the tunnel rats became the centerpiece of major military operations designed to clear and hold the Vietcong's traditional strongholds. In January 1966, Operation Crimp targeted the Siuchi district. Over 8,000 American and Australian troops descended on the area. While the infantry set up a cordon on the surface, the tunnel rats went to work below. For the first time, they began to systematically map the labyrinth. They discovered the immense scale of the complex, realizing that what they had previously thought were isolated tunnels were all part of one massive, interconnected system. A year later, in January 1967, came the even larger Operation Cedar Falls. This was a direct assault on the Iron Triangle, a notorious Vietcong sanctuary. Nearly 30,000 troops were involved. The operation began with a massive B-52 strike. Then, waves of helicopters airlifted infantry to surround the area. Engineers with heavy bulldozers followed, clearing huge swathes of jungle to deny the enemy cover. But the decisive action once again happened underground. The tunnel rats went in, not just to explore, but to destroy. They followed the telephone wires to the command bunkers. They located the main arteries of the system. They planted enormous amounts of explosives, collapsing key sections. They used acetylene gas, pumped into the tunnels and ignited, to create massive fireballs that would suck the oxygen out of the air, suffocating anyone hiding within. The Viet Cong were caught completely by surprise. Their ultimate fortress had been breached. Their sanctuary had become a trap. They fought back with desperate ferocity. They set up ambushes, waited in side passages, and booby-trapped their own dead, hoping to kill the men who came to retrieve the bodies. But the psychological blow was devastating. The core of their strategy had been the belief that the tunnels were untouchable. It was the foundation of their confidence, their morale, their very ability to wage war against a superpower. The tunnel rats shattered that belief. A captured Viet Cong soldier, when interrogated, expressed the shock and terror that was spreading through their ranks. "We were never supposed to be caught in the tunnels," he said. "The tunnels were our home. But the Americans came down into our home. They were like supernatural beings coming out of the darkness. The hunters had entered the lair. The ghosts were now the ones being haunted." The Viet Cong High Command was forced to reevaluate its entire strategy. The tunnels, once a source of strength, were now a potential liability. An American presence inside the network meant that their command centers were vulnerable, their supply caches could be captured, and their movements could be tracked. They began to use the tunnels less as living spaces and more as temporary transit routes. They built even more complex traps, specifically designed to kill the lone American intruder. But the damage was done. The aura of invincibility was gone. The statistics from these operations told the story of the tunnel rat success. During Operation Cedar Falls alone, the Allies captured over 23,000 tons of rice, enough to feed more than 13,000 troops for a full year. They captured 635 tons of weapons and ammunition. They seized over 500,000 pages of enemy documents. The Viet Cong infrastructure in the region was crippled for years. The cost was high. The tunnel rats suffered a disproportionately high casualty rate. The exact numbers are difficult to determine because they were not an official unit, but it was a job with a brutally short life expectancy. Many were killed by booby traps or in firefights. Many more carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The claustrophobia, the darkness, and the constant, intimate proximity to death left a permanent mark. They were an anomaly in the vast, impersonal machinery of the Vietnam War. They were a throwback to an older, more primitive form of combat. In a conflict of long-range artillery and high-altitude bombers, they fought with pistols and knives. While generals moved divisions on a map, they fought their battles one cramped, dark corridor at a time. Their story is one of profound irony. The United States, the most technologically advanced nation on Earth, found itself unable to cope with an army of peasants armed with shovels. Every high-tech solution failed, and in the end, the answer was to find men willing to become even more primitive than their enemy. The answer was a man with a flashlight, crawling on his belly in the dirt. The tunnels of Siu Chi are a tourist attraction today. Visitors can crawl through widened, well-lit sections of the network, getting a sanitized taste of what it was like. But the reality of that subterranean war is almost impossible to comprehend. It was a war fought in a world without light, a war of inches, a war of nerve. It was a war that proved that sometimes the only way to defeat an enemy who has burrowed into the earth is to find the courage to go into the earth after him. The Viet Cong believed their tunnels made them invincible, that the ground itself was their ally, their impenetrable shield. They were wrong. They learned that no fortress is impregnable when your enemy is willing to crawl through the gates of hell to get to you. They learned that the dark is only a sanctuary until someone braver, or perhaps crazier, decides to own it. This is the enduring legacy of the tunnel rats. They didn't just clear tunnels. They didn't just capture intelligence. They took the enemy's greatest strength, his most sacred space, and they turned it into his greatest fear. They proved that in the end, the war was not about technology or firepower or logistics. It was about the willingness to descend into the darkness, to face the enemy in his own home, and to drag him, fighting and screaming, into the light.